Today's video is about a European gun smuggling operation that smuggled firearms in a way no one can detect at the first sight. A London street feud that escalated into multiple murders, driven by retaliation and revenge, including a fatal case of mistaken identity and a gang that quietly ran one of the largest cannabis factories ever found in Lancashire. But they were all uncovered the same way. What none of them realized was how early police attention had begun. This is the story of organised crime in the UK, how violence and profit intertwined across separate cases, and how each investigation eventually caught up with those at the centre of it. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. By early 2017, a firearms trafficking network was already operating between mainland Europe and the UK. It was not chaotic or improvised. It was structured, deliberate, and designed to sit just beneath the surface of legitimate commercial movement. At the centre of the conspiracy was Stephen Spires, the organiser and UK-based coordinator. His role was to keep the operation functioning smoothly on British soil, overseeing storage locations, managing domestic movements, and ensuring that once weapons arrived, they were quickly passed into criminal circulation. He did not deal on the street, and he did not transport the firearms himself. His position was control. Alongside him was Denis Kolenchukov, responsible for logistics and overseas coordination. He handled arrangements beyond the UK, liaising with contacts in Eastern Europe, organising travel, and ensuring that purchases and collections took place without attracting attention. His role bridged the gap between foreign suppliers and the UK end of the network. Michael Nichols completed the core group. He was responsible for storage, movement, and onward supply once the firearms reached Britain. Industrial estates and rented facilities were used to keep weapons temporarily before they were moved again. The emphasis was always on speed and discretion, minimize time in one place, reduce exposure, and avoid patterns that could be spotted easily. Central to it all was a legal contradiction they knowingly exploited. We will talk this in a few minutes. Slav became the operational base. Its industrial landscape provided the exact anonymity that group needed to grow their operation. Vehicles, containers, and storage units moved in and out daily, offering perfect cover for activity that looked ordinary from the outside. From here, the UK side of the conspiracy was coordinated without any visible signs of violence or street-level dealing. Overseas sourcing and purchasing sat with those travelling regularly across Europe. Transport and concealment planning was handled separately. UK storage and distribution was controlled locally. Communications between the conspirators became routine from early 2017, with repeated trips and familiar routes reinforcing that this was a long-term operation rather than a single risk. As the network settled into its roles, attention turned to sourcing weapons that could be moved quietly, cheaply, and in volume. The sourcing of the firearms was built around a simple calculation: find weapons that could be bought legally abroad, then move them into a country where their possession was strictly prohibited. Eastern Europe provided that opportunity perfectly. In countries such as Poland and the Czech Republic, specific low-caliber revolvers could be purchased without the scrutiny that would follow a conventional handgun. The network focused on 4mm and 6mm Flaubert revolvers. On paper, these were classed as low-powered firearms in certain jurisdictions, sold with fewer restrictions and at relatively low cost. In reality, the group understood their true value. Once inside the UK, those same weapons became prohibited firearms, sought after by organised criminals precisely because they were rare, concealable, and capable of being converted. Two models became central to the operation. The École Arda 4mm Flaubert and the Attack Armor 6mm Flaubert were both compact revolvers, easy to transport in quantity and simple to dismantle. Their size made them ideal for concealment. Despite being sold as low-caliber weapons, they were fully capable of causing fatal injuries. Ammunition was sourced alongside the firearms. This was not incidental. By supplying both guns and rounds together, the network ensured that once the weapons reached the UK, they could be put into immediate use. There was no need for buyers to source ammunition separately, reducing risk and increasing demand. Getting guns was only half the problem. The real challenge was moving them across Europe without anyone realizing what was hidden inside. With the supply secured, the operation turned to concealment. The solution was mechanical, deliberate, and designed to survive scrutiny. Engine blocks were chosen as the hiding place, not for sophistication, but for plausibility. They were heavy, common, and expected to cross borders as part of legitimate trade. Each firearm was dismantled before transport. Components were wrapped, positioned, and sealed inside specially adapted engine blocks, altering the internals just enough to create hidden cavities while preserving the appearance and weight of an ordinary vehicle part. Once reassembled, the engines looked untouched. To customs officers, they were just another piece of machinery moving through Europe. Collections took place at an Orlen petrol station in Bolesławiec, a location chosen for its anonymity and ease of access. From there, the engines were loaded and transported by a Polish courier. Investigators would later confirm that the courier was unwitting, a crucial detail that explained how the shipments passed through borders without arousing suspicion. By the time police began piecing the operation together, evidence showed this was not a first attempt. At least 6 to 7 previous importations had already taken place using the same method. That confidence was recorded in writing. When the courier was later stopped, officers recovered diary evidence that can shape the entire story into a new direction. We will talk about this in a few minutes. The method worked because it blended into the background. There were no visible criminal indicators. Everything depended on appearing ordinary, and for months it succeeded. But after repeated journeys and growing volume, the operation finally crossed paths with intelligence that would change everything. By this point, the National Crime Agency had intelligence through an internal source about an incoming shipment that matched the pattern investigators had been quietly tracking. The route, timing, and the method all pointed towards an organized operation. Before the load could cross, action was taken. Officers from Border Force stopped the vehicle at Kacem just moments before it was due to enter the Channel Tunnel. On the surface, the cargo appeared ordinary, but this time, the concealment was examined closely. Inside the engines, officers uncovered the reality of what had been moving undetected for months. 79 handguns were found dismantled and hidden within the metal housings, alongside more than 4,000 rounds of ammunition. The weapons had been carefully packaged, deliberately positioned, and sealed in a way that showed pure experience. The scale of the seizure was immediately clear. The haul alone was valued at hundreds of thousands of pounds on the UK criminal market, even before considering what previous shipments may have delivered successfully. More importantly, the discovery confirmed what investigators had already suspected. While the seizure stopped that shipment from reaching the UK, investigators now had something far more valuable: proof of a wider network waiting back on British soil. With the Channel Tunnel seizure secured, investigators moved quickly to exploit what the intelligence had revealed. Now attention shifted immediately to Slough, where surveillance had long suggested a domestic hub sat quietly behind legitimate industrial activity. Police activity focused on the Seaborough industrial estate, spanning the Slough and Iver area. It was here that investigators identified a shipping container believed to be central to the operation. For the network, it was the final stage before weapons were moved onward to criminal buyers. On 3 July 2017, enforcement action followed. A van linked to the investigation was stopped near the Whip and Collar pub, a short distance from the industrial estate. Inside the vehicle, officers recovered 9 firearms contained within a plastic carrier bag. The discovery was significant, not only because of the weapons themselves, but because it confirmed that distribution was already underway, even after the Channel Tunnel interception. Searches were carried out almost immediately. The shipping was opened, revealing further firearms linked to the conspiracy. Additional premises connected to the suspects were also searched, with more weapons recovered as the investigation expanded outward from Slough. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a single delivery network, but a supply chain designed to keep weapons moving continuously. As follow-up operations were conducted nationwide, the full scale of the seizure became clearer. Across the investigation, the total number of firearms recovered was 97, a figure that evolved as evidence was analyzed and links between seizures were confirmed. As the full picture emerged, prosecutors began to calculate just how large and how dangerous this operation had really been. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors began to look beyond the firearms. Based on travel records, diary entries, and the established smuggling pattern, it was estimated that between 500 and 700 firearms may have been imported. Prosecutors also estimated that the network stood to make between £600,000 and £1.2 million in profit. The case reached its conclusion at Kingston and Blackfriars Crown Court, where the scale of the conspiracy was laid out in full. Sentencing reflected the hierarchy of responsibility within the operation. Stephen Spires received a sentence of 26 years imprisonment. Denis Kolensukov was sentenced to 19 years and 2 months, whereas Michael Nichols received a sentence of 15 years and 6 months. But while one operation was being dismantled quietly at the border, a separate feud in East London was already spiralling toward violence, and it would leave more than one life lost. Before directly diving onto our next case, let's uncover what motive led to that revenge killing. On the evening of 7th May 2017, violence arrived suddenly on Walthamstow High Street. Elijah Dornelly, just 17 years old, was attacked in an ambush that would later be recognised as the starting point for a chain of retaliation. The attack was carried out by Ezra Abeka Soares and Morgan Mockford. Investigators established that the pair lay in wait behind a phone box, watching the street before stepping out with knives drawn. There was no argument and no warning. The confrontation lasted seconds. Elijah was stabbed once in the stomach, a single wound that proved catastrophic. Despite the injury, he managed to run. He reached the nearby Arabian Nights Cafe, where he collapsed from massive blood loss. Emergency services were called and he was taken to hospital, but the damage had already been done. The stab wound had cut a major blood vessel. Elijah died a few hours later. At the Old Bailey, the jury accepted the prosecution's case. Both Abeka Soares and Mockford were found guilty of murder. Life sentences followed. Abeka Soares was ordered to serve a minimum term of 19 years, reflecting his age and role in the attack. Mockford received a minimum term of 17 years, alongside additional time for knife offences. But beyond the courtroom, the verdict did something else. It fixed responsibility. The killing of Elijah Dornelly was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a cause, and the consequences of that would soon unfold. Among those closest to Elijah Dornelly, his killing was never viewed as the act of two individuals alone. Within his circle, it was absorbed as a collective loss, and, for some, a humiliation that demanded a response. Elijah was associated with members of the Maley Boys, and his death was felt directly by those who moved with him and claimed the same territory. At the center of that reaction was Hamza ul-Haq. Elijah was described in court as one of ul-Haq's close associates. His death cut deep. In the weeks that followed, Hamza and others around him became increasingly confrontational. Conversations shifted away from grief and toward blame. The focus moved to territory, reputation, and the belief that an unanswered killing would signal weakness. Alongside Hamza were other Maley Boys members, including Loic Nengise and Wayne Russell. They had grown up around the same streets, and Elijah's death sharpened those boundaries. Ordinary encounters began to feel loaded, and names linked to rival groups were remembered and repeated. What had once been background tension with the Priory Court and Higham Hill group hardened into something deliberate. Elijah's killing became a reference point. Hamza in particular was later recorded expressing the belief that what had happened could not be left unresolved. The next act of violence would not be spontaneous, it would be deliberate, and it would not stop with the people who were originally responsible. By November 2017, the tension that followed Elijah Dornelly's killing had shifted into open retaliation. On an evening in mid-November, a series of attacks unfolded on St. James Street. A group of masked males entered a Subway store and a neighboring food outlet. Inside, acid was thrown at people believed to be associated with the Marley Boys. Among those targeted was Hamza ul-Haq. He was sprayed with acid, while another associate was stabbed in the chest. Others suffered burns and injuries as the attackers fled. The attacks were chaotic, but the impact was immediate. What had already been simmering hardened into certainty. Hamza and those around him interpreted the incident not as random violence, but as a direct provocation from rival groups linked to the Priory Court and Hyam Hill area. The idea that retaliation was inevitable took hold that night. Body-worn video footage later captured Hamza speaking to an associate shortly after the acid attack. In that footage, he was recorded expressing clear intent to retaliate. That same night, groups associated with the Marley Boys went looking for rivals. Vehicles were used to move between locations. Multiple areas were checked, but no targets were found. Witnesses later described seeing armed men in the street, prompting further emergency calls. From this point on, retaliation was no longer a question of if, but when. And when it came, it would not be directed carefully. On the evening of the 16th of November 2017, Kacem Mokrane, aged 18, left his home in Walthamstow after eating pizza. Before stepping out, he told his mother he loved her. Minutes later, he was dead. At around 9:15 p.m., Kacem was ambushed on Mount Pleasant Road. 2 vehicles pulled up and a group of around 10 males got out. They were armed with knives, machetes and swords. The attack was immediate and overwhelming. Among them were Hamza ul-Haq, Abdirizak Ali, Luca Griffiths, Kamil Kazmierski, and later identified participant Christopher Wilson. The attack was immediate. CCTV and witness evidence showed the group running at Kacem, surrounding him and forcing him back against a wall. The assault lasted approximately 25 seconds. In that short window, Kacem suffered multiple injuries, including catastrophic abdominal wounds. The attackers then ran back to the waiting vehicles and drove off. Emergency services were called and Kacem was taken to the Royal London Hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. Despite intensive treatment, his condition worsened. He died 4 days later, on the 20th of November 2017, from multi-organ failure caused by hypovolemic shock, resulting from the stab wound to his abdomen. Those responsible did not remain unidentified. Over time, meticulous investigation placed every key player and associates at the scene. We will talk about this in a few minutes. With Kacem's death, the feud that began with Elijah Dornelly claimed its second life and confirmed that retaliation had become organized, collective, and lethal. After the killing of Kacem Mokrane, the pressure on those involved intensified. Within days, Hamza ul-Haq left the UK and travelled to Pakistan. He remained there for around 4 months, a move would later describe as flight rather than coincidence. During that period, the investigation into Kacem's murder continued, while the feud itself remained unresolved. Hamza returned to the UK in early 2018. Within weeks, detectives were already closing in. On 19th April 2018, officers investigating the shooting of Joseph Williams-Torres executed a search warrant at ul-Haq's home address. We will talk about Joseph's murder in a few minutes. What they found shifted the case from violent retaliation to something far more deliberate. Inside the address, police recovered a handwritten list. Prosecutors later described it as a kill list. It contained the street names of individuals believed to be associated with rival groups. Among the names detectives believed were Kacem, Mokrane, and Joseph Williams-Torres. Next to some of the names were symbols and markings. The prosecution case was that these codes indicated Ul-Haq believed those individuals were already dead at the time the list was written. This discovery was critical. It showed that the violence was not driven by loss of control or sudden emotion. It was structured. Names were written down. Outcomes were noted. The mindset was one of completion rather than reaction. On the evening of 14th March 2018, Joseph Williams-Torres, aged 20, was sitting in a van with a friend on Essex Close, E17. The street was quiet enough that nothing about the moment suggested danger was approaching. Just before 9 p.m., 3 hooded attackers walked up to the vehicle. One of them produced a gun and fired at close range. Joseph was hit in the chest and in the legs. The shots were not wild or panicked. They were delivered quickly, with the attackers already moving away as soon as the firing stopped. The whole attack was over in under 2 minutes. The gunman ran from the scene and disappeared into the surrounding streets. Police and paramedics arrived, and Joseph was taken to hospital, but he did not survive the journey. He died en route, with the gunshot wound to his chest proving fatal. What made the killing even more brutal was how it happened. Joseph was not the person the attackers had come to find. He was mistaken for someone else, a rival they were actively hunting. The misidentification came down to appearance. The intended target was described as having a similar height and build, and that night he wore the same type of beanie hat. That was enough for the attackers to commit to the strike without checking who they were actually shooting. The feud now had its third victim, and this time the violence had claimed someone who was never meant to be involved at all. The investigation that followed Joseph Williams-Torres' killing was slow, technical, and relentless. There was no single breakthrough. Instead, the case was built piece by piece through volume and persistence. CCTV footage from the area captured figures running from the scene in the moments after the shooting. Their faces were obscured, but movements, clothing, and routes taken became critical. As officers widened the search area, one detail changed everything. A youth offender dropped a mobile phone near the scene while fleeing. That device was recovered and examined, providing investigators with a direct link to the attackers. The firearm used in the shooting was later recovered. Ballistic analysis connected it to other incidents, tying the murder into a wider pattern of violence rather than a single isolated act. Each connection strengthened the case and narrowed the circle of suspects. The scale of the work was immense. One officer alone spent more than 500 hours reviewing CCTV footage and body-worn video, tracking movements across multiple streets, timeframes, and locations. Step by step, the attackers were placed at key points before and after the shooting. Search warrants followed. Clothing worn during the attack was recovered from suspects' homes, matching items seen on camera. Phones, messages, and location data began to align with the visual evidence. Arrests were made over a number of months, not all at once, as each strand of the investigation reached evidential threshold. The court process reflected the complexity of the case. Some defendants were acquitted. One trial ended with a hung jury requiring the case to be revisited. Eventually, a retrial led to the conviction of Christopher Wilson, who became the 5th person found guilty in connection with the murder of Kacem Mokrane, further exposing the depth of the network involved in the violence. By the time the arrests were complete, the picture was clear. What began as street-level rivalry had grown into a web of retaliatory attacks, misidentification, and escalating violence. The reckoning came in stages, across multiple hearings at the Old Bailey, as the courts dealt with a chain of violence that had unfolded over years rather than weeks. Each sentence reflected a different role, but together they revealed the scale of what had been done. Hamza ul Haq received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. For the murder of Kacem Mokrane, Abdirisak Ali was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years. Kamil Kazmierski received 16 years, while Luca Griffiths was jailed for 14 years and 4 months. Years later, Christopher Wilson received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years following a retrial. For the murder of Joseph Williams-Torres, Loic Nengisi was ordered to serve a minimum of 21 years. The 16-year-old offender, whose name cannot be published for legal reasons, was given a minimum term of 18 years. Together with ul Haq, all three were held responsible for a killing carried out in error but executed without hesitation. While one feud ended in blood and life sentences, the next case shows how organized crime can thrive without a single shot fired, hidden in plain sight behind locked doors and industrial shutters. The operation was uncovered on 8 October 2019 when police entered the unit at Apex Trading Estate. What they found inside was not a small or improvised setup, but one of the largest cannabis farms ever discovered in Lancashire. Across multiple rooms, officers counted 4,537 cannabis plants, all at different stages of growth. Alongside them were 27 kilograms of dried cannabis, already prepared for onward supply. Taken together, the total street value was later assessed at approximately £2.6 million. The scale of the cultivation was unmistakable. The unit had been fitted with industrial-level growing equipment, including high-powered lamps, reflectors, transformers, bulbs, temperature gauges, and ventilation systems. The layout showed deliberate planning, allowing plants to be grown, harvested, and dried simultaneously to maintain continuous production. To support the operation, the electricity supply had been illegally rerouted. Underground cables had been installed to bypass the main supply, allowing the equipment to run constantly without detection through abnormal usage. The tampering was extensive enough that it took Electricity Northwest 13 hours to make the site safe and restore the legitimate power connection after the raid. Nothing about the setup suggested short-term use. This was a long-running factory designed for volume rather than risk, and as officers moved through the unit, it became clear that the people responsible had not only built the operation, they had been living inside it. Inside the unit, officers found the 3 men responsible for running the operation: Orel Guzi, Sulejman Loni, and Jacek Pieczur. All 3 were described as being of no fixed address, with the industrial unit serving as both their workplace and living space. The men had been living inside the factory, sleeping and eating alongside the cultivation rooms. Personal belongings were found mixed in with the equipment, confirming that the unit was occupied full-time rather than visited intermittently. Their presence ensured the grow could be monitored continuously, with plants tended at all hours. During the search, officers recovered £2,425 in cash, alongside a number of mobile phones. The phones were seized as evidence, reflecting the level of organization and communication required to maintain an operation of this size. With the factory dismantled and the men in custody, attention turned to the courts, where the full extent of the operation would finally be set out in sentencing. The case concluded at Preston Crown Court, where all 3 men admitted producing a Class B drug. The sentences reflected both the scale of the operation and the roles each played within it. Following sentencing, police made clear that the outcome was intended to send a message beyond Darwin. Officers described the factory as a serious example of organized criminal exploitation of industrial space, highlighting the risks posed to public safety through illegal electrics and fire hazards. Sulejman Layoni was jailed for 4 years and 6 months, the longest term handed down due to his deeper involvement in running the site. Orel Guzi was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, while Jacek Pieczur also received 3 years sentence. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK crime documentaries.